Well, hello there this evening. It's raining here in the part of the world that we're based at, but you're all welcome and it's great to have you. My name's Darren Morton. I'm the Director of the Lifestyle Medicine and Health Research Centre here at Avondale University College. And tonight I'm very, very excited about our special guest presenter. This presentation is actually part of a unit in the postgraduate lifestyle medicine course here at Avondale. And the focus of that unit is on smoking cessation, and we have our lecturer, our facilitator for that course is none other than Professor Renee Bitton, who is really a stellar expert in this space. We're very pleased to have her join with us, and I'm going to hand it pretty much straight over to her, and she's going to be introducing and welcoming our special guest. So lovely to have you with us, and I hope that you really benefit and enjoy the presentation tonight.
Thank you, Darren, very much. For those who don't know, I'm sitting in a field of illegal tobacco, in case you're wondering what that green leaf is behind me. And the reason why it's illegal tobacco, because we don't grow tobacco in Australia anymore. So if you ever see it, it's illegal, just so you know. So this is, as Darren was mentioning, part of this particular credentialing course that we're which is really wonderful and novel. All up in fact in Australia, but we'll talk about that some other time if you're interested in doing that, who are not part of the actual course at the moment, but are watching in any way. I'd like to introduce George Klein to you, and to remind you why we have invited George is because it's taken a long time and it's still quite difficult to actually talk to smokers, clinicians, people who work in health, that the basic salient substance in tobacco smoking is a very addictive drug called nicotine. And it's taken, and it still has taken, a long time. And Georgia and I have known each other for decades. Bringing this topic into the realm of addiction medicine has been some long haul. George started his working life in addiction treatments as a graduate counsellor in the Specialist Drug Treatment Community Health Centre in Sydney in 1981. I think I might have met him around about then. Mm-hmm. He spent 12 years, is that right, George? I think around about then we met. He spent 12 years there, including 6 years as the manager of the service. He then worked for years in the Department of Behavioural Sciences in Medicine at Sydney University, and he undertook research on the cognitive and functional impact of opiate dependence on self-care amongst heroin users. He moved to the Centre for Addiction Medicine in the Pean Hospital in the outer western Sydney in 1998 and spent 13 years there as a senior health education officer. For part of that time, he also worked part-time at the Transcultural Mental Health Centre in New South Wales, first as the evaluation researcher and then as setting up a service for people jointly afflicted by mental illness and substance abuse, that comorbidity, which we now know a lot more about thanks to George. He retired, believe it or not, he's not retired, in 2011, but returned to clinical work in 2012. That's what happens. You can't really not do anything, as a senior health officer in the Department of Gastroenterology and Hepatology at Nepean Hospital, where he works now still with people afflicted with viral hepatitis and liver disease, and people afflicted by liver cancer. George has done research on ranges of issues over the past 37 years, studying living conditions and costs of heroin addiction in sex workers in the inner city of Sydney, studies on people affected by hepatitis C, evaluations of residential drug treatment services, and 2 evaluation studies of family reports for the Family Court of Australia. He first became involved in clinical care of substance-affected parents in early 1980s, supporting patients in the Drugs in Pregnancy program at Crown Street Women's Hospital. And it's really extraordinary and wonderful to learn that in 2013, he was awarded the Order of Australia, the medal for his work in substance abuse treatment. So we're terribly privileged to have George, who has an extraordinary amount of experience in addiction and addiction medicine, and to give us the basis behind what addictions are all about. I'll now leave it to George to just give us an hour and a half of his wisdom. Thank you so much, George.
Thank you, Renee. I have to say that if I got the Order of Australia medal, you should basically be, a Knight Commander. Thank you very much for inviting me along to give this talk. It's the actual central premise of this talk is that after 40 years of practice, I'm obsessed by early humans. Physiologically, we are all Homo sapiens, hunter-gatherers, and a lot of what ails us has to do with those origins. So this talk is going to speculate a lot about what we were like when we didn't have agriculture, and with agriculture, discretionary feeding and everything that goes with it. So Mel, if you could take us to the first slide. Thank you. That was great. So I'm going to talk a little bit about a lot of things, and I hope by the end of it your heads are not reeling. I'll talk a little bit about our history as a species with intoxicants, a little bit about brain reward circuitry, which is the box or module in inverted commas in the brain that really regulates reward seeking and associated behaviours. Talk a little bit about drug dependence and risk factors for dependence. Talk a little bit about genetics, comorbidity and social ties. Thank you, Mel. So there's a lot of dispute about some of the things I'm about to say, but I'm relying on the Smithsonian Institute's Human Origins program for some of this, and reading that I've done widely on the origins of language. So the best guess is that our species, Homo sapiens, is around 200,000 years old, whereas Australopithecus, the first bipedal ape, was around about 1.7 million years ago. There's some very interesting work that's been done on differences in reward circuitry between Homo sapiens and other species in the same lineage. But the important thing is that Homo sapiens hasn't been around for all that long, really. And even more striking, language as a way of symbolically representing everything. And I don't just mean a private and discretionary set of symbols, but a consensual set of agreed upon symbols to represent everything, is thought to be maybe less than 100,000 years old. So it's relatively new. Stepping forward in time, agriculture in the sense of cropping in fixed locations has only really been around for about 15,000 years, to the best of our knowledge. Agriculture changes the game for Homo sapiens profoundly. Before we had cropping and settled agricultural sites, we spent our time looking for food. And so a lot of things like breeding and reward seeking weren't really available on a discretionary basis. We couldn't just do them when we felt like them, because most of the time we were looking for food. Agriculture made possible urbanisation and specialisation. It made possible a transition from a group of people that remained physiologically, their bodies remained convinced that food was always scarce, to a group of people that were increasingly able to develop sophisticated systems for doing just about everything. And what we live in now, the kind of civilization and technology we have now, is probably directly traceable back to the development of settled agriculture and cropping. I won't talk about idleness just for the moment, except to say that if you allow yourself to have a thought experiment about what our ancestors' lives were like, it doesn't take much imagination to think that perhaps during the times when food was scarce, for example, in very cold climates or even temperate climates, when winter came and food was relatively scarce, idleness was a way of conserving calories. So idleness, doing nothing, being lazy, may have been evolutionarily quite useful when food was very scarce. And that's important because our history with intoxicants is a history to exposure of, probably poisoning by, and then instrumental use of a whole bunch of different plant and other toxins. Thank you, Mel. It's the best thinking about addiction, as we call it in conventional terminology, is that it's a disturbance in our neurobiology based on a vulnerability in our old brain reward circuit. I want to say something about our wonderful reward circuit. We had to evolve voluntary and discretionary control of our behaviour. I'm sure that language played a very important role in that. Once we were able to symbolically represent things, we were then able to imagine things and basically create propositional constructs about the world and about experience. But Homo sapiens evolved voluntary control of behaviour. And that's important because voluntary and discretionary are very similar. Discretionary means I do it if I feel like it. And Homo sapiens is probably really the only species that is really fully discretionary in the way that it behaves. There's a very interesting theory called the thrifty gene theory. Some of you have heard of it, I'm sure. It's had some time among the endocrinologists, and it basically says that human beings are really programmed to get fat. Because of the food scarcity of our ancestors, people stored their calories in their bodies, and so our ancestors thought that eating until they were replete was probably a very good thing. The reason that it's relevant to us is repletion may not just be limited to feeding, even though there's a very specific endocrinology to feeding, which I'm sure all of you know about, the nuclei of the hypothalamus that control feeding and satiety. But it's not only feeding that seems to lean towards repletion in consumption. So we see that in the consumption of intoxicants. We see that in the consumption of other rewards like pornography or sexual activity. We see it in the consumption of things like gambling. It seems to be almost a predisposition in Homo sapiens. When you decouple reward seeking from strict bioenvironmental control, i.e. by food scarcity and resource scarcity, human beings are able to kind of indulge that discretionary reward seeking. I keep wanting to say, do you understand what I'm saying? But I can't see any of you. So I'm hoping and praying I'm talking slowly enough to be clear. We made a discovery about 40,000 years ago, according to some studies of the CYP450 genetics of human beings. About 40,000 years ago, it appears that we were exposed to these toxins, Saccharomyces cerevisiae, the brewer's yeast that synthesizes ethanol, delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, nicotine, and so on. They're all poisons. They're all synthesized basically to kill or poison other organisms that are trying to basically feed on the organism that produces the toxin. But we discovered how to use these toxins quite strategically for certain properties that they possessed. For example, we know that in Iran and in parts of India, people still use opium as a tonic. Tribal groups in India and traditionally in Iran use opium as a tonic. Some of you may remember the Ayatollah Khomeini, who was the first kind of leader after the Islamic Revolution in 1978 in Iran, being a very cynical drug and alcohol worker who worked with heroin users, I was always struck by how he looked completely off his face on opioids. And then I discovered through talking to some of my Iranian colleagues, that's because he was. And in fact, a lot of the mullahs in Iran use opium. So these intoxicants, these poisons have been used strategically. Obviously, you're aware of their use in the control of pain, but they're also used to stave off hunger. They're used to basically to be thermogenetic, to make people warm in cold conditions. People still trek in the Andes chewing on coca leaves. So we discovered these toxins. I don't know how many human beings died until they found the safe doses of them, but we're a resourceful species and we found a way of employing these toxins to our own purposes. Now, if you'll allow me to speculate a bit more, it doesn't take all that much imagination to consider that some of us may have been more susceptible to ditching the main game, which was livelihoods and feeding and familial affiliations and communities, and to become quite absorbed in the use of those toxins almost as a primary activity. One could imagine that even early agriculturally inclined human beings, or even, what am I saying? Even some Homo sapiens hunter-gatherers may have been susceptible to the use of those toxins, perhaps genetically, perhaps in the way they were basically wired otherwise, to become completely absorbed by them, especially if you think that maybe people used sort of intoxicants like nicotine and the opioid alkaloid in opium and so on. And, you know, ephedra, which was the active ingredient in the ephedra plant, which is the plant basis of amphetamines, if they use those things during times of food scarcity. Now, the brain must defend itself against these poisons. And as you all know, we defend ourselves not only with our brains, for example, reducing the responsiveness, number and conformation of postsynaptic neurons that engage with these toxins, especially, for example, opioid and dopamine receptors. By the way, are you all there? Can you all speak and hear me?
We can.
Yes, we can.
Okay, does everybody understand what I'm saying?
Very well.
Yes.
Okay. So the brain defends itself by reducing the number of responsiveness and conformation of postsynaptic receptors. The liver defends the body using the CYP450 enzymes to deal with these toxins. As you know, if you drink a lot and you drink for well, you may or may not know this, but I'd like to tell you, just to show off that I'm not just an ignorant drug and alcohol worker. If you drink for too long, you'll synthesize CYP450-2E1, and that's actually a marker of increasing alcohol tolerance. So the liver is another place where tolerance develops as a way of reducing the toxicity of these agents, which, remember, are fundamentally poisons. Thank you, Mel. So the pleasurable effects, those effects which are to do with the drug being perceived to be very rewarding and reinforcing, basically are mediated through the brain reward circuit. And as I said earlier, I didn't say it earlier, so I contradict myself. It's set up essentially, I guess, for nutrition, reproduction, and affiliation. That's how it evolved. It's prone to excess for the various reasons I cited. But another thing that you'll discover if you ever work with addictions, and this is where the devil is, it's a wicked problem, that the circuit is extremely faithful. And by faithful, I don't mean somatotopically faithful. I mean it's faithful the way a spouse is faithful. If your brain reward circuit decides that it loves something and makes it an apex reward, if you abstain for quite some time, nothing will basically fire up that circuit like that Apex reward did. And you will remain sensitized to that reward for the rest of your life. Remember that the circuit evolved under different conditions. It's basically a Morris Minor engine. It's not designed for modern, sophisticated technological civilization. It's designed for hunter-gatherers who never had enough food. And so it didn't need to deal with, I've had enough, thank you, let's do something else very often. Thank you, Mel. This is a schematic of the brain reward circuit. I'm not going to go through it with you. It's a bit complicated, but if you can look down to the bottom in the center where it says VTA, that's the ventral tegmental area in the midbrain, which is where the cell bodies of dopamine cells reside. And as you can see, the brain reward circuit talks to just about everything, as well you might imagine it does. It doesn't work in isolation at all. It talks to the hippocampus, which is critical in the formation of long-term memory. It goes through a structure called the nucleus accumbens, which finds its way to the medial prefrontal cortex through a circuit. It's involved with the amygdala, which is related to fight-flight behavior, threat appraisal, and the regulation of emotions. It communicates with the hypothalamus. So it's involved in a conversation with all other brain circuits all the time. And that makes sense when you think about it, because the circuit is active in most of the things we do. For example, at the moment, some of your brain reward circuits might be thinking, this is good or this is hard going. I wonder what I'll have for tea afterwards. So the circuit is there operating in the background all the time. Thank you, Mel. And I've already said that all of these intoxicants are poisons. And I've mentioned that some genetic studies, which I've cited at the end by Sullivan et al. 2008, suggest relatively recent exposure and how we discovered how useful they could be. And then, being the total sluts that we are, we went and cultivated these plants to increase their potency for their psychoactive properties. Thank you. These are the usual suspects: the brewer's yeast, Nicotiniana tabacum, the coca plant, Papaver somniferum, the opium poppy, Camellia sinensis for tea, and Cannabis sativa for cannabis. Thank you, Mel. This is definitional, and I think you guys can probably read it in your own time, but essentially, addiction has to do with people continuing to use an intoxicant despite harm and against their own desires to cease. So to that degree, the person is something of a passenger in their behaviour. People affected by addiction find it difficult to stop and are highly likely to reinstate once they stop. And there's been a long dispute about whether it's to be regarded as what I would call a neurobiological disorder as opposed to a failing of moral character. Now, I love the term failing of moral character because I think we're all kind of wired to have failed moral characters because of our evolutionary history. It's just that some of us are very unfortunate. Approximately 3 months ago, a patient that I've looked after for 10 years, a very sweet and lovely young man, died at the age of 42 from alcoholic liver failure, notwithstanding 10 years of interventions, some of them very aggressive, including 3 admissions to an involuntary ward at Bloomfield Hospital. He died, and he died tragically. Approximately a month and a half later, his father, who was also alcohol dependent, died of liver failure. So there's a genetic element to it. And both of these individuals, who I knew extremely well over 10 years, had long periods when all they wanted to do was to be free from the compulsion to continue drinking. They had a tragic view of their lives, both of them, and they were very sad people and very lovely people. Thank you, Mel. This is the ICD-10 classification, which you can find, and I won't take up your time with it except to say these are the criteria for substance dependence in ICD-10, and good to familiarise yourselves with them, with those criteria. The next slide is from, I think, the DSM-4. It's been superseded by the DSM-5. I tend to use the ICD-10 in all my clinical notes. So thank you very much, Mel. Let's move forward. In terms of common everyday lay understanding of addiction, you can forgive non-intoxicant addicted people in their own lived experience of living with and dealing with and loving people who are intoxicant addicted or even gambling addicted, to form the view that it's a failure of the person's will or their motivation. We find it in the trade easier to regard it as a sensitization of the brain, which is very aggressive and results in a very aggressive reorientation of priorities and responsiveness. So, for example, behaviour associated with the intoxicant use becomes highly ritualised. We have all kinds of rituals associated with intoxicant use. One of my party tricks when I give lectures for Renee in Vivo in person is I remind people that they'll be having a coffee break after me, and I invite them to watch the drug preparation and consumption ritual at the coffee table. It's a drug ritual. Another thing that happens is that intoxicant sensitive people become highly reactive, not only to the compound itself, but everything associated with that intoxicant. So tobacco companies are very good at putting lingerie around cigarettes to make them kind of exciting. And people become highly aroused by the sight of a packet of cigarettes, not aroused sexually, I mean aroused by the association with the drug. And so it is with injecting drug users becoming aroused around intoxication if they see someone injecting or the sight of a needle, someone who drinks, seeing a pictorial representation of alcohol. To that degree, we think of people who are highly sensitized and neuroadapted as being passengers to some degree. Their personal sense of their own agency, their own volition has become somewhat corrupted. They're not free to make an informed choice to not crave the intoxicant, even if they can make an informed choice to stop taking it. And many people do, they go to detoxification units or they cold turkey at home, but they can't stop wanting it. And there's a difference between wanting and having. And to the extent that you continue to want something, even after you stop, means that your volition to that degree is corrupted. Thank you, Mel. A lovely article that Renee showed to me some years ago is an article by a couple of Australian neurobiologists who postulate that a very nice way of understanding addictive behaviour is to do with failures in response selection, e.g., will I drive home past the bottle shop tonight? And if I can't make a decision to not do that, that's kind of a failure in the region of the anterior cingulate cortex. And there's also a failure in response inhibition. If I put a drink in front of you, how easily will you be able to not drink it? If I put a cigarette in front of you, how easily will you not be able to smoke it? If you don't mind, I'd like to share something personal. I am an ex-smoker, and even after all these years, very occasionally, I have a dream. It's a recurrent dream, and it goes like this. I'm at a barbecue. Someone has Champion Ruby tobacco. They offer me a cigarette. I roll it. I take 3 or 4 drags on it, and then I'm horrified to discover that I'm smoking after all these years of not smoking. That's a failure of response inhibition in my sleep. So how sensitized am I? There are a couple of other things about addiction that are very problematic for people that try to treat it. There's a compulsion to continue taking the intoxicant, an inability to stop, and a tendency to reinstate impulsively. One of my patients that I've known for many years, he's an alcohol user and an occasional user of methamphetamine, is a star pupil in rehab. On the first day of his discharge after completing the program, he goes to the pub. Reinstatement impulsiveness. And I have to say, people who are intoxicant sensitized are not a uniform group. Some people are not that impulsive in reinstatement. People with the most aggressive disease have the most impulsive reinstatement after abstinence. They're not all created equal, which is good, because otherwise I think there'd be much fewer clinicians working in addictions treatment. Thank you, Mel. This is just from NIDA. I just wanted you to know that it's out there. It's a nice little diagram illustrating dopamine reward pathways. Dopamine is considered to be the apex neurochemical in reward circuitry. It's not all drugs that you take as intoxicants directly act on dopamine, but all of them indirectly act on dopamine, even tea and coffee. And we think that the mesolimbic dopamine circuit, the one that's related to reward behavior and addictions, was originally there in Homo sapiens as a way of ensuring that we spotted important stuff in the environment. It was a, hey, look at that kind of molecule. But it's become increasingly the excitement molecule. Thank you, Mel. And that's another nice schematic of the brain reward circuit with the VTA down in the midbrain and projecting to the nucleus accumbens, which is the so-called pleasure center. That term absolutely cracks me up, but that's what it's been called forever. And then projecting into the medial prefrontal cortex. Thank you, Melanie. There are a number of different dopaminergic pathways in the brain. If I had time, I'd talk a bit about them because they're very fun and interesting. But the one that's involved in addictions is the mesolimbic pathway. Thank you. Next slide. This goes back to Homo sapiens and Australopithecines and our kind of ape origins. The brain, as you all know, is hierarchically organized. And at each level of the brain, different kinds of things, different kinds of functions come into play. Why do I include this schematic? Well, I include it because when you think about the hierarchical organization of Homo sapiens brains, it's not hard to imagine how easily things could kind of go wrong. The neocortex is called the neocortex for a reason. And the idea of, the executive cognitive functions, which sort of subsume volition to some degree, relatively recent evolutionary arrival. So not hard to imagine how things could go wrong when you've got such a strong motor underneath driving a lot of survival behavior. Do you know about, some of you have seen that lovely graphic of the triune brain, the sort of reptilian brain that says, can I eat it? Can I have sex with it? Do I have to kill it? The mammalian brain that says, are you my mummy? Do you love me? Do I love you? And the kind of neocortex which says, let's send a rocket to the moon. So those three systems overlaid on each other. Thank you, Melanie. This is from the EMCDDA report, and all I really want to say right now, because it's got to do with the localization of different aspects of brain functioning that are pertinent to addiction, is have a look at the slide, and if you're interested, get hold of this very wonderful report It's now more than 10 years old, but it's still an outstanding overview of the neurobiology of addiction that was developed by an Australian, Wayne Hall, for the European Union. Thank you, Melanie. Okay, I'm going to talk a little bit about a couple of molecules that are kind of molecular substrates of some of these things I've been talking about. The first one goes by the glamorous name of delta phos-B. Repeated exposure to drugs of abuse and even some rewards lead to an accumulation of isoforms of delta phos-B in a subset of nucleus accumbens and dorsal striatum neurons. Now, the nucleus accumbens, as I said a moment ago, is the so-called brain pleasure center. I don't know, whenever I say that, I can't help thinking of Barry White. It's kind of, a bit corny, but if you're repeatedly exposed to certain kinds of intoxicants that have a kind of high reward pleasurable impact, you start to accumulate isoforms of delta phos-B, and it accumulates slowly. It declines very, very, very slowly, even after withdrawal, and it doesn't expire in abstinence. And the important thing about delta phos-B is if someone's been addicted and they abstain, their delta phos-B will not go down for months and months and months. So that's a molecular substrate of one aspect of sensitization to intoxicants, that it develops slowly, it consolidates, and it doesn't decline for ages. It's a bit like gamma GT. All of you know gamma GT. It's a kind of classic liver function enzyme that's thought to be associated with heavy drinking. Of course, it gets deranged by a million other things, but let's leave it alone, the poor devil. Gamma GT can go up into the thousands. And even when a person stops drinking, gamma GT2, because it's somehow involved in hepatic tolerance to alcohol, declines only very slowly, and it might still be in the hundreds a year or 2 years later. And I know some of you might be thinking, maybe the patient wasn't telling the truth, but this is in cases where we've been able to verify the person's abstinence from alcohol. Thank you. Next slide. The next glamorous name is cyclic AMP response element binding protein, otherwise known as CREB. It's activated within the nucleus accumbens, the pleasure center, by opioids and stimulants. It increases sensitivity to the rewarding effects of these intoxicants, but in order to defend itself, the brain and the liver protect the body by developing tolerance, which means you need higher doses for the same level of psychoactivity. It's also associated with adverse mood states, so it may have a role in withdrawal. It's certainly associated, when it's elevated, with depression and low emotional reactivity. So it's been observed that antidepressants will tend to normalize CREB. And CREB's very important as a substrate, a molecular substrate for tolerance, and especially the negative emotional states associated with withdrawal. Thank you, Melanie. That's me. Just step through these. It's a bit silly. I'm going now into object relations and attachment theory, so everyone, please forgive me. I'm borrowing from the work of Donald Winnicott and his associates. Go back one, please. Yes, so people we observe clinically may become quite emotionally attached to their intoxicants. People talk about taking refuge in the bottle. They talk about, saying that cannabis is their best friend. They say that their methadone isn't holding them, and so on. Winnicott was a British psychoanalyst who was very, very famous about 5 decades ago and was very influential even now. He talked about a construct he called the transitional object, which was a way that human beings were able to kind of maintain a degree of emotional secure attachment in contact with the outside world. So the very first transitional object is really the womb, and then the breast, and then the bottle, and then the dummy, and then, you know, maybe the teddy bear, the security blanket, and so on. For some people, intoxicants really do become sources of secure attachment. It's important to at least consider that when we're treating people that are highly far along in their careers of dependence. The next slide, please. This is just a silly graphic. Just click a few times, please. Keep going. Once more. Yeah, so you remember Lord of the Rings and the Gollum, who said, "My precious," in relation to the ring. Well, I think Tolkien was really illustrating classical addiction when he created the Gollum and his obsession with an addiction to the ring. And these intoxicants are, and as I said, remember earlier I said the reward circuit talks to everything else. It's not at all surprising that one of my patients might have said to me many years ago, "If I stop smoking cannabis, I will have nothing," and would burst into tears, for example. Okay, moving along. Another thing that has been observed in the study of intoxicants is that the setting in which they're taken and the beliefs you have about them will greatly influence how they impact on you. If, like me, you were brought up to believe that drug abuse of any sort was a very bad no-no, strangely, tobacco was exempted from this in my generation. But the idea of taking drugs like heroin or even cannabis was deeply frowned upon. My friend, who was a close friend, who was a painter, was forever on at me to take acid, LSD, with him in the 1970s, and I just refused. It was so far out of my values. I thought that because I had a very negative view of lysergic acid diethylamide, that if I took it, I'd have a bad experience. That's what they call the set that I had mentally with regard to the drug, the expectations and beliefs. The social environment within which an intoxicant is consumed is also very important. People are initiated into intoxicant use often in social groups. And so when you look at someone who's has been dependent on a substance for a long time, you need to look at their social milieu as well, and who's in it and what roles they play and how many affiliates who use intoxicants are present, because those people reinforce each other's use. Thank you. Move on one more. That's just silly. We'll just move on from that. Thank you. We can, that's also, yeah, look, all I want to say about this is that when a person has become reliant on the use of an intoxicant to the extent that it's become a primary priority for them, then it's not very hard to understand that that substance use exerts a highly regulatory role in their daily life. And so one way that clinicians like me think when we actually converse with patients and try to understand their lived experience of their dependence is to understand the regulatory influence of their intoxicant use on their daily practices. And invariably what you see is that the quality and range of their activities is very impoverished. The second thing you see is that the drug becomes what I call the chemical snap of the fingers. So you're not feeling very happy, you use the drug. You're feeling a bit low, you use the drug. You have a fight with your family, you use the drug. You lose your job, you use the drug. You use the drug to make yourself feel better. You go straight to the reward circuit mainline. You use your apex reward to induce a feeling of well-being. And that, for some people, means they can set aside genuine, deeply held doubts about whether or not what they're doing is going to really promote loving, functional living. And when I treat people, I'm all the time trying to see into the spirituality in what they're doing. You know, I'm all the time trying to think about, well, how does this person's life, how does this person's intoxicant use express their most deeply held values? Where do they get their sense of reverence from? I'm not going to sit in judgment upon it. I want to understand it, because if I want to help them bring about changes, I need to negotiate with them to be abstinent for a period of about a month, so I can see how they are when they're not using the intoxicant, what kinds of things would need to be buffered and protected so that they could have a more sustained episode of abstinence. So understanding how their daily life is regulated, punctuated by their intoxicant use, the minutiae of that is really important. Thank you, Mel. All you people out there in invisible Zoom land, are you all right?
Yes, we're wonderful. Thank you.
Yes,
What
all
about
good.
the rest of you? You okay?
Yeah.
Good. All right. This is just silly. Let's just move on from that slide. This is just a schematic I developed to try to illustrate something about what I call the rippling out effect of intoxicant neuroadaptation. So the intoxicant use will ripple out, permeate, and impact on just about every aspect of daily functioning, from the most fundamental kind of life-maintaining behaviours through to interpersonal behaviours. Think of people drinking together at a party or in a pub, or smoking together outside an office building. Thank you, Mel. This is really interesting, but I don't really have time to go into it now, so I might set that aside. Be aware that all intoxicants can acutely and chronically compromise just about every aspect of functioning, from basic sensorium all the way to complex social behaviour. We can talk about that in question time if you like, I'm happy to. But to illustrate very simply, think about how functional people who are alcohol dependent are when they're very alcohol dependent on maintaining family relationships, for example. There are so-called functional alcoholics, but if you talk to the families of so-called functional alcoholics and talk to them intimately the way that I have done over many decades, they will tell you that the alcohol-affected person was often inappropriate, somnolent, disinhibited, unavailable, or physically or mentally absent at important family events. I'm talking about everyday family events, not parties and birthdays, but the everyday social intercourse of a family. Thank you, Mel. This was a study that was done many decades ago by a sociologist called Gerard Stimson, and he was interested in the influence of social ties among heroin users at a time when prescribed heroin was available in London and parts of the UK. He was looking at the question about whether or not you would still need to be in a network of other drug users if you had prescribed heroin. And he was interested in the extent to which these patients had conventional ties or ties to other drug users. And his outcome measures were legal, medical problems, extraneous drug use, and their dose of heroin. And he followed these people up over 10 years. I think it was his doctoral study. He's a really wonderful man, by the way. I've been sycophantic towards him on LinkedIn, and his eyebrows are well and truly raised, let me assure you, but a wonderful, wonderful researcher. He identified 4 groups, and this observation that he made 50 years ago is still pertinent. There's one group of people that had very high ties to other drug users and very few conventional ties. In 1968, he called them, quote, the junkies, unquote. They were on low doses of prescribed heroin because they had so much extraneous drug use, and they had lots of presentations to ED, lots of overdose, lots of legal problems. A second group who were employed but liked to party and who had mixed social ties, he called the two worlders. They liked to party, but their doses of heroin were somewhat more elevated because they didn't party all the time. There was a third group he called the loners. These people were disaffiliated. They weren't really affiliated with anyone. You'll see these patients on methadone and buprenorphine programs. You'll see the two worlders and the so-called junkies as well on any methadone or buprenorphine program. And finally, there was a group he called the stables. These were people who were employed, had no drug-using affiliates. There was no non-prescribed drug use, no crime, no medical emergencies, and these people were on very high doses of prescribed heroin. In some cases, members of their own families didn't know they were on prescribed heroin. You need to know what it looks like to recognise it. And this kind of model, this matrix, seems to hold true for many people that use intoxicants. It's a nice heuristic that's based on some empirical research with prescribed heroin users. Thank you, Mel. I'm going to talk briefly about risk factors for drug dependence. I don't know if your slides are large enough for you to be able to read this, but I'm using the old 4Ps biopsychosocial model to talk about pharmacological, biological, psychological, social, legal and regulatory and cultural influences on intoxicant use. And the columns are predisposing, precipitating, perpetuating and protective factors. It's too detailed for me to go into right now, but some highlights. Obviously, genetics plays a role, as does age of initiation into intoxicant use and family history. In terms of precipitating factors, exposure, incarceration, specific drug effects, which might be deemed to be extremely helpful. Back when I started, we saw a lot of, especially young women, and probably a lot of young men who subsequently disclosed that they'd been sexually abused in their families. The horror and the shame of it was really overwhelming then. It wasn't much talked about. And they discovered that heroin really relieved their symptoms of PTSD. So exposure at a particular time as a precipitant. Perpetuating factors include, of course, dependence, but also that idea of increasing reliance on the intoxicant for feeling okay, for a sense of personal meaning. Stigmatization maintains people in drug use lifestyles. People on methadone, as a matter of fact, are discriminated against. People who smoke are actually discriminated against now. So that can be perpetuating for some people. And in terms of protective factors, obviously having social capital and a more enriched range of personal options could be potentially protective for someone who has been dependent and who subsequently abstains. With many of the patients that I treat, I encourage them to do 5 things every day that I believe to be, clinically believed to be protective. I encourage them to spend time in green spaces. I encourage them to engage in exercise. I encourage them to keep a journal to basically get things off their chest. I encourage them to engage in some form of meditative or spiritual practice. And then I encourage them to have what I call 10 jollies, 10 rewards a day, knowing that no reward will be as triggering for them in terms of their reward circuit as the apex reward. But these things are protective in the sense that they will tend to help take the edge off craving and a sense of being lost without their primary intoxicant activity. Thank you, Mel. That's a nice schematic from the National Institute of Drug Abuse that says it more eloquently than I was able to say it. The interaction of biology and genes, environment, and the drugs themselves. Thank you, Mel. There's a lot of work that's been done on genetics and addiction, and no single gene will guarantee that anybody goes into drug use. It's more like the interaction of genetics and environment influences initiation, transition to ongoing use, and perseverance with use. It's known that there's a high heritability of certain kinds of dependence. There's no clear pattern of inheritance. It's complex, and it's known that substance abuse and mental health problems often co-occur. So a genetic vulnerability to one may make one more susceptible to development of the other. So if you're prone to depressive illness, you may be more vulnerable to the use of intoxicants. Thank you, Mel. This is just about the sources of evidence, and I'd like you to be able to read this in your own time. It's very, very interesting, but it's basically saying that they've done a range of research studies to try to see if they could identify what predisposes people to developing a dependence, for example, on a substance like alcohol, and includes things like twin studies of people who've been separated at birth, genome-wide analysis, candidate gene studies, intermediate phenotypes like increased impulsivity, and animal models. Thank you, Mel. And this is a little table that just shows what's known about genetic influence. And you can see that genetic influence affects, has a 60% influence on initiation into smoking. 52 to more than 60% influence on males being at increased risk of alcohol dependence. The heritability is relatively high. Thank you. Increasingly, we're interested in epigenetic influences as well. And these are kind of possibly reversible modifications in gene expression, methylation, and phosphorylation processes. And, delta phosphB is an example of epigenetic activity. Epigenetic factors may alter the person's initial response to a drug. For example, if their mother or they themselves are exposed to great adversity and stress. Epigenetic factors may affect a person's continued response to drugs or the propensity to develop tolerance, withdrawal, and relapse. A very simple example of that, the Martin Teicher article many years ago about the neurobiology of trauma and the fact that the hippocampus is richly endowed with cortisol receptors and cortisol is neurotoxic, and Teicher postulated that extreme traumatic stress would result in some toxicity to the dominant hippocampal area, which could affect brain activity. Well, that's also likely to have an epigenetic effect on people's susceptibility to use an intoxicant, just in terms of their stress response. Okay, moving along. This is an important slide. It's probably, just step through all of them, please, Melanie. This is probably the last slide I want to focus on because I'd like to give you an opportunity to tell me how terrible no, go back, please. Go back, yeah. Give you an opportunity to tell me how terrible the lecture was or to ask questions or make comments. These are some links between substance abuse and mental health problems. I've alluded to their co-occurrence earlier in this lecture, and I just want to talk a bit about them now, explicit links. So the first one is, as I said earlier, all intoxicants can cause psychological problems both acutely and with prolonged use. That includes tobacco. Secondly, many people who are affected by mental disorders are also reliant on intoxicants. Thirdly, we discover often people in drug and alcohol treatment disclose or reveal that they had pre-existing mental health problems, often from early adversity, sometimes inborn. For example, people that were prone to that kind of melancholic depressive illness may have been self-medicating with stimulants and alcohol all their lives before they were diagnosed. Next, if you habituate to an intoxicant as your regulatory response to basically everything, you're reducing the resilience of your own endogenous wired-in neurochemical stress response systems. And this is still more poignant if we consider that the person may have been already a little fragile when they were born or in their early life. Once you habituate to using a drug like tobacco or nicotine, I should say, or ethanol or the opioids or cannabis, once you habituate to that and you use that intoxicant basically to regulate, to punctuate every daily activity, you basically knocked out the entire resilience to stress system and you've replaced it with your apex reward. And that's bound to cause mental health problems in terms of social adjustment. The next line of intersection is that being addicted is not great for your physical or mental health. Lots of bad things happen to people who are dependent intoxicant users, including people who become dependent on tobacco. Lots of bad things happen. Lots of physical health problems, lots of ostracism, lots of personal cost, lots of medical complications. So it's not great for you to have a career in inverted commas of intoxicant use and dependence. And finally, as a person transitions out of a dependence, people struggle, especially in the first 2 years, with a very dysregulated emotional system. They have trouble self-soothing, they become more reactive to stress, they have to rebuild a repertoire of coping, and remember that their apex reward, the one that fired off all the dopamine, is not available to them. So people are often very fragile psychologically, especially in those first 2 years. Now, everyone, I realise this has jumped all over the place and I really apologise to you. I just wanted to give you an overview of some of the really critical things that you'd want to think about when you're thinking about people who are substance dependent. And I'd like to give you an opportunity to ask questions or make comments.
Thank you so very much, George. Thank you. Mel, are you going to... Oh dear, I dropped out. What happened?
You're right, Renee. We can hear you. People have turned off their cameras. So I've stopped share. Is that okay, George? Or would you like...
I'm happy to take questions from disembodied voices if that's what people want. I didn't mean to be pointy by saying that. Whatever you're comfortable with.
No worries.
Could I ask a question?
Yeah.
So given that a lot of people, well, sounding very stereotypical, I guess, but perhaps people that you see in psych wards that they have mental illness, perhaps they have other addictions besides tobacco, and there used to always be that, oh, you know, we'll deal with one at a time. Like, is it better to say, let's deal with that addiction before we tackle the tobacco, or you know, or is it?
I think that's a really...
Tobacco is always like the last one.
That's a really good question. I think in terms of dealing with tobacco, I think that's a question that would probably be better put to Renee, because she's going to talk about a model for a very systematic and physiologically grounded treatment for tobacco dependence. What I would say is that it's two things I want to say that are really pertinent to people in acute settings like psych wards. One is that you have no choice but to try to address the immediate problem. And one of the ways you do that is by decatastrophizing their intoxicant use. I mean, the last thing you want is to increase their shame and sense of failure when they're dealing with an acute mental health decompensation. So you try to de-escalate, try to decatastrophize it, and just see if you can get the person stable enough to be thinking about how we can get through this immediate crisis, what's actually precipitated it, what needs to be done, what are some supports that could be put in place. Now, I realise that in a lot of psych wards, of necessity, and through no fault of their own, a much more perfunctory form of medicine is practiced. It tears me up inside to see that. But the resources aren't always available for the kind of care that would be most appropriate. The second thing I wanted to say is that whenever I encounter a patient who's substance dependent, I'm keenly interested in their spirituality. And by that, what I mean is what they hold in their heart to be really sacred. And I always try to engage with the person at that level. And if they need to converse with me about their substance dependence while they're talking about their psychosis or their mania, I will absolutely talk to them about that. But what I won't do is I won't sit in judgment on it. I won't stigmatize them for it. In fact, I often say to people who are dependent, you know, this culture is very, very addictive. We're drowning in our stuff. We're consuming ourselves as a species to extinction. So I think it's a little sanctimonious for me to sit in judgment on an alcoholic when all that person wants to do is to just consume that one substance. I try to, as much as possible, not stigmatize and shame the person, because what I really want is to engage them in a conversation about their actual existential and human problems, and to try to think about where addressing their substance use might fit into that. I don't know whether that's a very satisfactory answer.
No, I'm finding it very interesting, your what you're talking about and your view, and I can imagine that your patients probably find you very accepting, I guess.
I'm 70 years old and I've been doing this for 41 years. And I really am appalled at the high-handed hypocrisy of people that drive around in four-wheel drives and buy ostentatious jewellery and expensive meals and overpriced houses, and they look askance at people whose addictions are less overt. I think we're all stuck in a society where consumption is seen to be an imperative, and it goes back to our Homo sapiens roots. So when I talk about spirituality, I'm talking about that sense of what the person holds most dear in their heart, because that never actually dies. Well, that's not quite correct. It doesn't die in most people, even under the most adverse circumstances.
Can I just make a comment about the treatment in detox and drug and alcohol services generally, and smoking, because smoking, of course, is not allowed now in acute hospitalisation. So it becomes actually quite problematic what to do, because people are coming off whatever substance, or they're being treated for whatever substance abuse they're there for, and concomitantly are not allowed to smoke. And the confusion of these two often withdrawal inducing substances gets really complicated. So we are certainly going to address this in our treatment, as you mentioned earlier, George, component of this course, because it is, as was said earlier, that it's usually the last substance people stop with is tobacco, and we would rather it was the first that is addressed, because it impacts so much on other substance use.
Yeah.
So we will address it for those who are listening in the course. We're going to address this very topic once we come to treatment, as you mentioned.
And of course, I mean, Renee, I don't want to steal your thunder, but smoking induces CYP453A4, which is involved in the breakdown of psychoactives, so psychotropic substances. So in an acute mental health setting, if someone's deprived of tobacco, they're going to be much more affected by their psychotropics.
Correct. And that's still to be learned, but in this group, but yes, that's part of what we'll be talking about.
Yeah.
Sure. Are there any other questions from any of the group or discussion? I'd like to bring up something myself, George, that you mentioned, but I'm not sure if I've ever told you this, but there is a wonderful paper by a fellow called Peter Hayek from the UK, from Mike Russell's group in London, the late Mike Russell, who ran the very first ever smokers clinic in the world, who was a psychiatrist. And Peter Hayek's paper is called The Dammit Effect, about dreaming about the substance. And smokers dream about smoking after they've quit. It's very common.
Yes.
They don't necessarily volunteer that they have, but it becomes somewhat of a nightmare, as you mentioned.
Yes.
And it's called the Dammit Effect because you wake up thinking you've smoked and you think, oh shit, I smoked. Oh no, I didn't. That was a dream.
Yes.
And that's why he called it, it's an acronym for the Dammit Effect. But what's really good about this is it's negatively correlated with relapse.
That's good.
Negatively correlated. People think, oh, does that mean I really want to smoke? Does that mean I'm suppressing my urges or whatever? I mean, in fact, it's the opposite. If you have this dream, and even your recurrent dream, you're more likely to remain abstinent. How interesting is that? What is that
Very
about?
interesting. I can tell you how unnerving those dreams are, because it really feels like I've reinstated.
Yes.
And immediately on realizing that I've done it, I'm thinking, oh God, I'm going to be dependent again. I'm going to have the compulsion to do more. In the dream, this is going through my head.
Right. And you have this wake up mini panic attack that you actually did it.
Yes. Yeah.
Yes, that's how he described it, and he actually studied that and asked people, because people don't volunteer that they've dreamt about it. Or sometimes they do and they say, oh my gosh, I dreamt it. Doesn't that mean I really, really want to do it? I'm suppressing my real urges. And
I have patients in my private practice who haven't used heroin in 30 years, who still have heroin dreams.
Yeah, personally, it's a good sign. Now,
Yeah.
exactly why that is interesting in itself. Yeah.
Well, yes.
Sorry, I was just going to just when we were talking about withdrawal and other drugs or prescribed medication can give you withdrawals as well.
Yes.
So what's then not the difference, but is the fact that even if you are stopping taking a medication and it feels unpleasant, is the fact that, we talk about addictive personalities, I guess, the fact that you're able to just push through and say, but I really want to stop taking that, rather than taking it because when you don't feel you
Oh, I see.
Am I explaining? The
I think
medication
so.
I'm thinking of is an antidepressant that has quite uncomfortable side effects.
Yeah, they all
when you
do.
try to stop taking it.
Yeah,
and
which one are you thinking of? Venlafaxine?
Yes. Yeah, venlafaxine. And the fact that some people say, oh, it was so unpleasant, I just decided to stay on it.
Yes.
As opposed to saying, well, even though it's uncomfortable, I really want to stop taking it. So is that saying you don't have a less addictive personality than someone that says, look, that's way too uncomfortable.
Well, I'm not aware of any clinical encounter or any literature which indicates that drugs like venlafaxine are experienced as rewarding. So they're not experienced as agents which produce a sense of enhanced well-being and euphoria, and for that reason, the Krebs effect, the withdrawal effect, is absolutely there. And it's absolutely there because there's changes in norepinephrine and serotonin, and to some degree dopamine in withdrawal. Yes, there's a neuroadaptation, but the important difference between the NSRIs like duloxetine and venlafaxine, and even the SSRIs and even older antidepressants, the tricyclics and so on, is that none of these agents really induce any kind of euphoric well-being. They can, I mean, their mechanism of action is not primarily dopaminergic. They, you know, the NSRIs do what they do by blocking the reuptake of norepinephrine and 5-HT serotonin. So they don't really act on very directly on the dopamine system at all. People don't say, I got off my face on Effexor the other night, or man, you know, I had a couple of Cymbaltas and man, I was flying. They don't say that because the drugs just don't act on those systems. I think what you're highlighting is that CREB, you remember I talked about CREB earlier on?
Yep.
So
Yeah.
CREB can be present in other withdrawal states, and it can be affiliated with the negative mood and low mood that you associate with those reductions. I think, I mean, I haven't really done a lot of reading about the withdrawal phenomena that are associated with transitioning off an antidepressant or changing over from one to another. But I think obviously there's a very potent neuroadaptive process involved. And we know from the mechanism of action of these drugs that it's got to do with autoreceptors on the presynaptic cell being blocked by the drug, keeps the norepinephrine and serotonin out in the synapse for longer. Eventually, the postsynaptic cell kind of wakes up and smells the roses. For some people who are very fortunate, that means there's a marked improvement in well-being. Unfortunately, for too many people, it doesn't mean that. It just means you're dependent on this agent, and after a while, it stops improving people's mood and well-being. So we're still not, we still haven't got the magic bullet for conditions like depression, sadly.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
say
No,
something.
I was more kind of interested in is your ability to, because obviously not everyone gets addicted to things. Everyone tries things, but not everyone then decides that that's it. I need to do it again and again, and you know, to the point where you become physically addicted. So what is it that, besides genetics, but is your ability to say, well, I'm going to push through those withdrawals and stop, as opposed to I'm going to.
Yeah.
Does that determine whether you're someone who is a little bit more likely to become addicted, or those people that swap an addiction? So I've stopped drinking, but now I'm gambling, or.
I think the compulsion to persevere and the search for a chemical snap of the fingers is more of a byproduct of dependence in people who have already neuroadapted. Having said that, there are some people that are very vulnerable to that kind of behaviour, people with attention deficit disorder and attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They have less successful inhibitory control over their choices, and they tend to self-stimulate a lot more. So some people are predisposed to it. Some people are thought to be thrill seekers. They want to have high intensity experiences, and intoxicant use can provide that. There are some medical doctors, I'm sure you know, who are base jumpers, and they get their thrill seeking from risking their lives jumping off cliffs with parachutes. Some thrill seekers, some people that are kind of wired that way, get their thrills by using intoxicants. Some people find the prospect of using something that's proscribed by law very exciting. I I was the foundation tutor in the graduate medical program at Sydney Medical School in 1997. And one of my wonderful students, they were all graduates, all older. This wonderful man told me candidly, and he wasn't an sort of Anglo-Australian, it's actually from Singapore, told me that he was very attracted to drugs and the idea of taking drugs and getting altered and stuff. So there's something in terms of the attraction. In terms of the ability to basically survive and move on from dependence once it's formed, yes, I think if you have a high level of self-efficacy, a high level of self-reliance, if you're more resilient psychologically, you're more likely to not become dependent. If you're psychologically hardier, as the personality literature says, you're
Can I
less
say
likely to
something
become.
about personality? And if you don't mind me just interjecting here,
Yeah,
this term in addictive personality, I thought had been put away, given all the neuropsychopharmacology that we know about addictions. What's your view of the so-called addictive personality? Which
I
don't
think
personally.
that we're talking, what we should really be talking about is people who are, for various reasons, thought to be prone to fixation on one specific apex reward, like an intoxicant or gambling or sexual activity or food. And I'm not sure whether a personality is the right descriptor for that, because I think the determinants of it are quite complex. I think some people might be a bit more prone to running to excess with things, and that's probably what people meant by the addictive personality. But I think would probably be more, I don't know what you think, Renee, but I'd probably feel more comfortable saying persons who for various reasons are more predisposed to get fixated on one specific apex reward. And I think there might be some biology in there.
Yes, not only do I believe that that is the case, as well as this heritability factor, which unfortunately does it doesn't absolve the user, but it certainly gives you gives them some education. I think that's the word, into the causes and the background as to why they're using the substance that they're using, and why they have little agency over that, or loss of autonomy over that, because they don't understand their loss of autonomy, and nor do their friends and family, for example. And it's important, I think, as a point of education, to describe this. You did originally, right in the beginning, say this isn't a question of willpower, lack of motivation to not use it. This is loss of autonomy. As you say, they're not in the driver's seat; they're in the back.
Yes.
And so, I think this description of personality, addictive personality, is unfair to the user. It's an unfortunate descriptor, I think.
Can I share some learning that you provided to me many years ago now? It's very, very simple. Some people smoke a hell of a lot and some people don't. The people that smoke a hell of a lot, Renee pointed out, are fast metabolizers of nicotine. And we look with loathing on those people. The 50 cigarette a day smoker is massively stigmatized, even though their only crime is being a rapid metabolizer of nicotine.
That's correct. That's right. Now, if they don't know that and nobody around them knows that,
then they're the scum of the earth.
That's terribly sad for everybody.
Yes.
And once you learn that, the people around them learn that, and the family members learn that, it makes one heck of a difference to everybody.
And it's quite possible that people that become alcoholics, some of them have poor serotonin systems that aren't very robust. And it's possible that ethanol in some weird way normalizes that for them, at least while they're affected by the ethanol. So it's complex. But if you're hardy, if you're self-reliant, if you've got high self-efficacy, if you come from a culture where this kind of behaviour is massively frowned upon, you're less likely. Can I share something with you from my days as an academic? I was down the hall from a colleague who was doing a study of Tourette's syndrome among Mormons. There are families of people who are Latter-day Saint church members who have Tourette's. They do not blaspheme in their tics.
Right.
They don't blaspheme. Isn't that interesting?
It is interesting.
There's some kind of regulatory control over the tic by the community.
Uh-huh.
That's really interesting.
It is very interesting.
It's a complete digression, and
No, but it's very interesting anyway.
yes,
So is that to, is that to do with that it's never been something that they've been exposed to in their
it's.
upbringing, so that's why it's not involved in the tip?
I think it's that that act is so proscribed within their culture and their
Oh, okay, yep.
values that it's just not. It just doesn't appear as an option. And Tourette's is an important analogue of addiction. People say exactly the thing they don't want to say.
Mm.
So it's a real analogue of response inhibitory control, a failure.
I've got to say this. I don't know if you know this, but Tourette's has been treated with nicotine patches.
I'm not at all surprised. Yeah.
And you'll all learn that some other time. So this is a segue to talk about next week,
Yeah.
George, and to thank you very, very much.
Been my great pleasure. I hope I haven't kind of left you too overwhelmed and exhausted with my rambling. Thank you very much, everyone.
Thank you so
That
very
was
much.
great. Thank you very much. Very interesting.
So
I
the
might-
segue-
I might-
sorry,
I might sign
Nicotine.
off now.
well, the segue to nicotine is because that's really why we've invited George to speak about drugs of addiction and talk about nicotine next week, which is what we will be doing, and quite in depth. Thank you so very much, George.
Good night, everyone.
And
Bye-bye.
just
Thank
before you go, sorry, George, if you're still here.
Yeah.
Just to add my thanks to what you presented tonight. Absolutely fascinating work. And what I really appreciate, I think, a theme that's run throughout this presentation is the non-judgmental nature of your approach to it, which really spoke volumes to me. And I think there's a really powerful insight that you mentioned there, that we all have addictions of different
Yes.
kinds. And I never made that connection that, people, I've got a really expensive bike over there that I can't stop riding. It's I think that there's something really quite powerful in that thought there. So yeah, really thank you for your presentation. Thank
My
you for
great
sharing
pleasure.
your expertise and certainly the manner in which you've presented it.
My great pleasure. Thank you. Good night.
Thank you, George.
Good night.